And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Have you ever heard of the video game Civilization by Sid Meier? I'm sure a lot of you have. It's been around since the 90s. Strategy game. The simplest way to describe it is basically a digital version of Risk. The first versions of Civilization were PC exclusive. I think up until, recently they weren't available on consoles. Anyway, long story short, I had never really heard of the game other than in passing, wasn't familiar with it at all. I was never a PC gamer, so it wasn't something I had access to. But last year, my son got a Nintendo Switch for his birthday, and I picked up a copy of Civ 6 for, I think, like $20 at the store, thinking I might check it out, at some point down the road once or twice. Well, from the first time I played it, I've been hooked on this game. And this isn't a plug or a commercial or a paid ad or anything like that. This is going somewhere. I wanted to bring it up because that game is so enticing and so addictive because it's basically open-ended from a strategy point of view. I mean, you can war game, you can engage in diplomacy and trade, and you can build a resource storage pool. You can get into finance and banking and do all these things basically, in hopes of global conquest. You can launch space expeditions and build great universities, build wonders, all sorts of crazy stuff. And without going into the specifics of the game or making you go out and buy a copy of it and play it just by talking about it so much, it made me think, all the hours I've spent since this lockdown playing that game, more than any healthy person should, to be honest with you. I like to play that game in bed at night when everybody else in my house is asleep, and I can easily, plug 2-3 hours into that video game. But it made me think a few days ago that there are people who do this for a living. I mean, not play the video game, but there are people who war game and strategize and basically walk through all these scenarios. People in the Pentagon, people in the White House. That's what they do for a living. And it's fun. Like, the video game idea of it is fun. The idea of conquest for conquest's sake, for growing and building something, we do it not because of any need or any benevolent ideology. Maybe we convince ourselves through nationalism that there's some benevolent ideology behind it, but at its core, we do it because it's fun. And it made me think, what about the real world consequences or the real world great game that we're all living in right now? Civilization's really nailed it. They've nailed the entertainment and the strategic draw of what actually happens on a global scale between nation states. And they found a way to package that and distill it down into a video game that they can market to people. And I see why people have loved it for decades. And now I'm somebody who loved it. I just spent the last 2 minutes proselytizing to you about it. But at its core, that video game encapsulates everything that makes the modern world so dangerous and yet so compelling all at the same time. It feeds into the natural desire of mankind to dominate, to seek new lands, for conquest, for domination. And we don't stop until we, scratch that itch. And even then, there's just always more lands. There's more things to accumulate. In the video game, the game ends when you either, consume all of the resources and convert the whole world over to your way of living, either through culture, through science, or just through military domination. But in the real world, it's not so black and white. In the real world, there's a lot of casualties, a lot of innocent people caught by the wayside of this global game between nation states that just spend their whole lives trapped. And it made me think that this is what Eisenhower warned us about. When he left office, he talked about the dangers of the military-industrial complex, something that just grows and grows until it has a life of its own and reaches a point of critical mass where there's just nobody who can reel it back in. President, a prime minister, nobody. There's just no way to put Pandora back in the box once she's let out. And now we're far down that path.
A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. Another factor in maintaining balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government, must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. During the long lane of the history yet to be written, America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. Such a confederation must be one of equals. The weakest must come to the conference table with the same confidence as do we, protected as we are by our moral, economic, and military strength. That table, though scarred by many past frustrations, cannot be abandoned for the certainty agony of the battlefield. Disarmament with mutual honor and confidence is a continuing imperative.
I don't think anybody in their right mind now thinks that the military-industrial complex is going away anytime soon. The only way it could even remotely happen is if it collapsed under its own weight. And it made me think, all of this has happened in a time of relative peace in the world. I mean, the last 70 years has been known as the Long Peace. Ever since World War II, there has not been a conflict between major nation states. And we've had Vietnam, we've had the Korean War, but we haven't had major empires, so to speak, or large first world countries go head-to-head directly since the end of World War II. And for good reason. You know, if it were to happen in the modern world, the consequences would be unthinkable, truly unthinkable. But yet the prospect of it hangs over our head like some diabolical sword of Damocles just waiting to slit our throats. And it makes you wonder, is there a day when that sword's going to fall? I mean, we all feel like it has to sooner or later, right? Just human nature dictates that at some point there has to be a coming of blows between a rising power and an established first world power. We've talked about it on this podcast. If you go back and listen to our Thucydides Trap episode or the Colder War episode, which was earlier on, where we talked more about the dynamic between the former Soviet Union and the United States. Well, the Soviet Union, now Russia, is a fading power. Some might say that's changed with the presidency of Vladimir Putin, but it's a nuclear power, so it doesn't really matter at this point. And this is what I mean by the sword of Damocles. As long as you're a nuclear power, you're always going to be relevant on the global stage. So Russia has a permanent seat at the table. But now, to add on top of that, you've got China, which by all measures is quickly becoming the most powerful, most influential nation on the planet. Many might push back and say, well, the U.S. isn't going to give up that seat anytime soon. And that may be true in terms of diplomacy and just establishing international order. But China's making a run for it. And everything they've set out to do, they've done in record speed. People said they couldn't do it. They already have the biggest economy in the world. Just by sheer manpower, they outnumber the United States 4-1. And now their Navy is rivaling ours, to the point where some say that by 2025, 2030, they'll actually have the most powerful Navy in the world. So I've learned in the last few years to never underestimate China, which just brings another seat to the table, a seat that is not on the best of terms with the West. So all that's got me thinking, between my time spent obsessing over this stupid video game and my time thinking about global affairs and the war gaming that goes on in the Pentagon, it's got me thinking, what is the current state of things in actuality? Where are we in terms of this long peace? Are we still in the early stages? Is this something that can go on inevitably? Are we in the waning hours of it, or are we somewhere in the middle? And beyond that, what would a new conflict look like? That's what I want to talk about in today's podcast. And I think that this is going to really be a hard thing to nail down, because obviously almost every prediction anybody makes about global affairs and military are, going to be wrong most of the time. But I also think that so many pieces have already kind of fallen into place. If you look at this intricate chessboard that we live in, so many pieces have already started to take shape on the board that you can kind of see which way the wind is blowing. And to, a trained eye, even an untrained eye, somebody astute, somebody who's just kind of paying attention to global affairs or just knows their history, you can kind of see how things might play out in the next 12 months to 12 years. And the first thing I'd like to point out is that I think this has already begun. The next global conflict, the next major confrontation between nation states isn't something that we have to fantasize or forecast a decade down the road. I think it's already begun. And the early stages actually have begun in the last decade. If you recall, in the waning years of the Obama presidency, there was what they called the strategic repositioning. And basically what that was pulling U.S. forces out of Europe and out of the Middle East and repositioning them into the South Pacific, the Asian sphere, or the Asian theater. That would be the South China Sea. Well, why is that? Well, that's because of basically what we discussed in our Thucydides Trap episode, that China is a rising power, and everybody else who has a seat at the table sees that. So they're trying to position themselves to contain China and basically inhibit its growth. You're not going to be able to stop it, but you can kind of string them up and slow them down a little bit. And that's kind of been the posturing of the United States, or at least it was until the end of the Obama presidency. So at the end of the Obama presidency, 2015, 2016, you get this new guy, Donald J. Trump. And this isn't a political podcast. Many of you know I'm not really on either side of the spectrum when it comes to politics. And for that reason, I live in kind of this lonely place where nobody agrees with me when it comes to politics. But I'm too liberal for a lot of you, and I'm too conservative for the rest of you. So I'll leave it at that from a political perspective, and this won't be a political statement. But regardless of your opinions about Donald Trump and his presidency, I will say this, and this is a credit in his favor. He wasn't a warmonger. Many people thought he would be. Many people thought, Donald Trump's going to come in, he's going to get the nuclear code, it's going to be the end of the world. To be honest with you, I was more concerned that would be the case if Hillary Clinton became president, because she comes from that old neocon kind of paradigm of the hawkish, military-minded folks in her inner circle who kind of have that game theory that I was just talking about, that video game theory sort of from Sid Meier Civilization, where they kind of view the world as a chessboard and we need to be spread around it as the global police. Donald Trump took the opposite approach. He had more of an isolationist mentality. Basically, let's restore things in the home front and pull back our footprint abroad. And I respect that. I think you can go too far into isolationism, but the United States has not even broached anything near isolationism for the last several decades. So it was kind of a breath of fresh air to hear somebody say we're not going to be the global police anymore. We're going to bring our troops home and we're going to work on strengthening our own four walls, our own borders. That was a draw for me. Now, I have 100 other things I could point out that are negatives about Donald Trump, in my opinion, but I think this was a very, very positive one. So for the last 4 years, as a consequence, we haven't had to worry about the prospect of a confrontation with Russia or China because we've kind of pulled back from being those global police. Now, the downside of that, some might say, is that China's been able to move forward unimpeded, and they've been able to grow and reach their own goals faster than ever. You know, they can point to the islands that they're basically just building in the South China Sea, literally creating islands and militarizing them so that it would become, strategic positioning in the event of a war in the South China Sea. All that to say, we've kind of gone through this lull in the last 4 years in terms of, prospects for true nuclear holocaust because the power players at the table have kind of de-escalated. But now what? Now you've got a Joe Biden presidency on the horizon. At least it seems that way. And if that's going to be the case, you're going to have a lot of familiar faces calling the shots again. An Obama president, that's kind of a Freudian slip, but a Biden presidency is going to be an Obama presidency 2.0. What you're going to see in a Biden presidency is just rotation of the chairs. You're going to see names and faces, chiefs of staff, strategic intelligence advisors, folks like that who served in the Obama administration. You're going to see them come in and do the same for Biden. A lot of those folks that he's already named to cabinet positions were folks who had a seat in the Obama White House. Well, past is prologue then in this regard. What you're going to see is again, that ramping up and that strategic repositioning into the South China Sea. You're going to see a military buildup there. China's not going to sit back and take that idly. I know people talk about Beijing, Biden, and there's all these political ads out there saying, Biden is in the service of China. That's not true. That's just not true. Simply not true. Obama and Biden were starting to tighten the noose a little bit on China, and they were concerned, I think, about China's rapid ascent to the extent that it looked like at one point in 2015, 2016 that we could have some sort of skirmish at sea that could get out of hand really quickly. I'm not saying that we're going to jump right back into that level of intensity, but it does seem like we're going to start positioning again in that direction. The isolationism that we've had for the last 4 years, that's over. As long as the populism that Donald Trump embodies is not in power in the White House, you can forget about any sort of isolationism. Biden is a globalist. Obama was a globalist. All of that is going to come back to the forefront, and you're going to start to see this expansion and this pressure, the cooker being turned up again on China and then also on Russia. But look at China primarily. But when I say that it's already begun, I look back to a time like the second term of the Obama presidency. I also look to what Russia did when they pushed into Ukraine to take Crimea. And I just see the last couple of years as a pause into this trajectory. And I see us moving back toward into that in 2021. If you recall the very beginning of this year, even though Trump is an isolationist, he's also very pro-America and pro-Israel. So he did still take a very strong-armed approach to Iran, an ally of China and Russia. I mean, it ended with Soleimani being killed in January, being assassinated. He was the head of the Quds Force, basically the equivalent of our, covert operations here in the West. So now you have the end of the year. Israel just assassinated a nuclear scientist, which is more of a symbolic thing. It's not going to impede their program at all if they want to push forward nuclear weapons. I think Israel is just trying to send a message, probably to the West, saying that we're not going to stand by while you re-implement a nuclear treaty with Iran. Anyway, all this to say that people seem to know that the tide is turning a little bit. Netanyahu and the Israelis are concerned about a Democratic White House here in the West. The West seems to be putting people back in power who are going to tighten up the policies against China in the East. And then you've got China and Russia who are concerned about that happening. So all that to say, 2021 and beyond is not going to be a time of calming rhetoric and de-escalating. It's going to be a time where militaries continue to ramp up and position themselves for what I think many have begun to see as inevitable. It's inevitable because it's already begun. It's begun on a covert stage between espionage, cyber warfare, which is a whole new front in military conflict, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit, and then also in the finance and the economic space. One of the first things we did to Iran was basically lock them out of the banking system and froze all of their international accounts, basically shut them off from the world. And that's why they've been so hamstrung. Well, now, because the banking system is so interlaced and so dominated by the West, China is trying to create their own system outside of the confines of the United States. Russia's doing the same, and some of their allies. If they succeed in doing so, the United States would virtually, but also materially, have to go to war with China. They would have to, because our currency would be at risk, and therefore the state of our economy. We're the greatest debtor nation in world history. If China were to separate from us and to operate by different rules, we would lose any bargaining power that we have. Having the greenback, the US dollar, is the reserve currency of the world, the reserve fiat currency of the world, gives the United States bargaining power that literally nobody else on the planet has, and it allows us to get away with things in terms of debt, in terms of growth and expansion and monetary policy that no other country in the world could get away with. So don't think that that's being overlooked either. People far smarter than me, people in positions of power who have the means to control and implement policies, are well aware of what's happening and what China is trying to do. The BRICS nations a few years ago were talking about this. That would be Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They're not all allies, but when it comes to finance, they are all on the same page in terms of trying to set a new paradigm and break away from Western domination. So what does it look like, this new conflict that we're entering in? We're in the early innings, maybe the first decade of something that's going to culminate into a hot war some point down the road. In my opinion, a date not too far into the future. Well, I can tell you this, and I've been pretty adamant about this over the last couple of years, and I'll stick to this. The major players will be the United States of America and China. Those will be the two opponents going head to head. And then their periphery of allies will be involved. This is because of what we outlined in Thucydides' trap. The dynamic of an established power versus a rising power. I won't rehash it here, but I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. The second thing I'd point out is that despite all the talk about nuclear war and World War III being fought with nuclear weapons and World War IV being fought with sticks and stones, there may be some truth to that, but it's not going to start out that way. Nobody has a death wish or a desire to watch the world burn in nuclear radiation. It's not likely to happen. I think the beginnings of any sort of global conflict would begin as conventional war. That's not to say that it's any less devastating or dramatic, but it will be conventional. People talked about North Korea possibly going nuclear. That's not going to happen. Nobody has a death wish. Even the Iranians, even if they get a nuke, they're not going to go bomb Jerusalem or Tel Aviv tomorrow. It just won't happen. None of these regimes are suicidal, and that's what using a nuclear weapon would be right now. Suicide, mutually assured destruction. Therefore, the dominant pieces of technology that you would need to keep into account when you're talking about the next global conflict would be the great missile defense systems that exist right now. That'd be the THAAD system on the west and the S-400 or the upcoming S-500 system in the east with Russia. So Russia's already been selling this missile defense system to some of their allies. I believe they sold some to Syria. They sold to Iran. I don't think they're in any weapons trade agreements with China, but I could be wrong on that. But the S-400 is widely thought to be the most powerful, most intelligent, most advanced anti-missile defense system on the planet right now, even better than the THAAD system in the West. So you would look to things like that. I mean, just conventional lobbing of missiles, and then those missiles being shot down by defense systems, etc., to the point where you would eventually need mobilization on the ground. You would need infantry. So that puts us right back to where World War II ended, in Vietnam and every other war since. We would have boots on the ground fighting their opponents through a scope on a gun. And that type of warfare greatly favors China. And why is that? Well, like I said earlier on, China has a 4-to-1 manpower advantage over the United States. It's literally called the billion-man army. They could mobilize a military force unlike anything the planet has ever seen before, and they are well aware of that. The Chinese ground infantry would be almost insurmountable without the use of nuclear weapons or significant overpowering them with air defenses and naval defenses. Now, I'm not saying those things can't happen, and we will talk about that briefly in a few moments, but what I would like to point out is that this would definitely begin as a conventional war, and that's why everyone's repositioning to the South Pacific. Because one advantage that the United States has that cannot be overlooked or undermined is its geographic advantage. We're surrounded by two great oceans on the west and on the east, and for that reason, it makes a land invasion of the United States, at least in the early onset of a war, virtually impossible. Nobody's going to be bringing the war to us for two reasons. One, our geographic positioning, but two, just the logistics and the technology required to do that. Nobody else has the ability to do it. It has the naval presence or the Air Force presence to make that type of an infiltration. So for that reason, we would be bringing the war to them, as we always have through history. And that is why this strategic repositioning in the South China Sea is so concerning right now. Our naval power is unsurmounted in the West. It's unmatched, but China is quickly closing the gap. I think the U.S. has like 46 aircraft carriers compared to China's 2 right now, but China has so many powerful weapons and aircraft carrier busters and things like that that it would make the numerical advantage almost irrelevant in just a few years' time if they continue advancing at the rate that they are. Additionally, China is building ships faster than anybody thought humanly possible, and for that reason, we do think that they will probably achieve parity with the West within the next decade. If that happens, our biggest advantage is gone, because it is the United States Navy that makes it almost impossible for any foreign nation to even approach the U.S. borders. So what would the theaters of war look like in this new global conflict? If we have a new global conflict between the great nations on the world stage, there will be multiple theaters of war. Just like in World War II, you had the German front or the European front. You had the Italian front in the Middle East with the Turks and the Italians. You also had the Eastern front, the Pacific front, which by many accounts was the most brutal. The Ostfront, the Russian and the German front, the deadliest front certainly in terms of just sheer body count. And then a bunch of other smaller fronts, naval fronts, for example, in the sea. Most modern wars are fought in multiple theaters like that. World War III would be no different. I should say will be no different because, as I said earlier on, we've reached a point where this is inevitable. It's going to happen in our lifetimes. There will be many theaters to this war. As I said, number one and the primary theater of this war would be the South China Sea. China knows this. They're building islands, literally creating them in the ocean right now as we speak. They're spreading out strategic military sources, creating stockpiles, and creating a zone of control that will make it hard for any invading force to get through unscathed. But once you get out of the South China Sea, there's going to be some land theaters there that are going to be key. Number one, the North and South Korean border. The DMZ, the demilitarized zone, would quickly evaporate in the event of a third world war, were China and the U.S. to enter into conflict. Within a matter of days, either North Korea or South Korea would cross the DMZ and reignite the Korean War, which never had a ceasefire, by the way. The war officially never ended. It's just been a long temporary truce. What I think is likely to happen is that the North Koreans, with the backing of Chinese foot infantry, would push across the border into South Korea. They would attempt to bring the war to the South Koreans, knowing that their greatest advantage would be the element of surprise and to act swiftly and quickly. If they could conquer Seoul and South Korea, the war would effectively be over for the South Koreans. However, the Americans know this, and they've been waiting for this for decades, and therefore we have a large number of troops on standby in South Korea, as well as naval offshore support, just waiting for the moment where they have to intervene and actually, support the South Koreans. And not to undermine the South Koreans themselves, by the way. The South Koreans are known to be a well-trained army these days, very well equipped with Western technology, and they're said to fight like demons. So the South Koreans would not, take it lying down. They know what's at stake if the North Koreans invade. And I think that North Korea would be biting off a little bit more than they can chew if they were to invade South Korea proper. But however, as I said, they'd probably be backed almost certainly by Chinese infantry. And at that point, all bets are off because China has literally a limitless number of bodies that they could throw at a foot invasion. So South Korea, in my opinion, would likely lose, but at the expense of hundreds of thousands of human casualties. The United States, therefore, would be forced off the Korean peninsula. If that were to happen, they would lose one of their key strategic positions in Asia, therefore making it much harder to operate offensives against the Chinese mainland. They would have to reposition the rest of their forces outside of that location into Taiwan, which we'll get to in a moment, or into Japan. And I think Japan actually would probably be the driving force who actually launches any sort of offensive against Russia on the east or China. But in any case, the Korean theater would either be a bloody stalemate or it would be a North Korea-Chinese victory. Hard fought, but a victory nonetheless. The next theater would be Taiwan. Taiwan has been in the headlines since I was a child. I remember being in first grade hearing about disputes between China and Taiwan, and people talking even then about it only being a matter of time before Taipei gets taken over and brought back into communist China's fold. Well, it still hasn't happened. Taiwan has maintained its independence because of the muscle of the United States. And I promise you, this thing I can say with certainty in a podcast where almost nothing is for certain. This one thing is, if and when World War III breaks out, China will move to take Taiwan. It may be a matter of first importance. I possibly should have mentioned this first because it could even happen quicker than North Korea moving in to the DMZ and trying to launch an offensive against South Korea. That's how important Taiwan is to China. I think that if China took Taiwan, and they probably would, I think that if you asked me this a decade ago, I would say that the U.S. would blow China out of the water if they, tried to launch an assault to take Taiwan. The U.S. Navy was that far superior to the Chinese Navy. But as I mentioned, where we are now versus where I think we'll be in 5 to 10 years when this conflict actually materializes, it's highly unlikely that that advantage will exist any longer. And therefore, China will, just through naval superiority and manpower superiority, overrun the Taiwanese and the American resistance, and they will take Taiwan. I think they will prioritize that above all else. And if they do that, you can basically just mark it down in the win column for China, that they would take Taiwan and that they would quickly militarize it and use it as a base of operations and strategy for the war in the Pacific. It also would give them a strategic operating base to be able to divert forces north against Japan as well as south into the Philippines, which would be a U.S. stronghold, Guam, the Philippines, some of those territories. So Taiwan would be key for China, and therefore I think they would prioritize it above everything else. You could think about it like the way Russia responded to Crimea when Ukraine had its little internal rebellion, and the people of Donetsk and the eastern part of Ukraine resisted and rebelled. Well, what did Russia do? They didn't run right in and go to try to subdue things in Kiev. No, they went and took Crimea because it was a matter of strategic importance to them. China would not waste the opportunity to jump on Taiwan and to bring it back into its sphere of influence as a matter of first order. I don't think that America's Navy could survive the Strait of Taiwan if Chinese domination persists in the Taiwanese theater. If China were able to take Taiwan, even if they aren't, even if they were just operating solely as a naval force from sea in the Strait of Taiwan, I don't think America could survive it, sending naval ships through there. I think they would just be utterly obliterated. So for that reason, I think the U.S. would quickly cede Taiwan and just take the loss and reposition strategically into other places, as I said, like the Philippines and Japan, where they already have strong positions. If the U.S. were to push on and fight to reclaim Taiwan or to hold Taiwan, I think it could come at cataclysmic cost to the U.S. Navy. It would make Pearl Harbor look like a 5-year-old girl's birthday party. The fact that China's been amassing troops in the southeastern border tells me that this is a matter of first priority to them, because that's exactly where they would need to launch from to take Taiwan. So China, much like how Russia has troops massed on their western border right now with Ukraine, and they would probably jump on the opportunity to take all of Ukraine back into the former Soviet Union at first opportunity. China has that same sort of approach with Taiwan, a massive number of troops right on the border ready to launch at any moment. Now, a big wild card here would be Vietnam, because Vietnam, if you look on a map, lies just south of China, and Hanoi is just across the southern border. Now, in the Vietnam War, obviously, the Viet Cong was within the sphere of influence of China, and it was hostile to the United States. Well, not so anymore. Vietnam and the United States are allies, and they have been for quite some time. For that reason, the U.S. would have a strong foot just within striking distance of major cities in China as long as they maintained that presence in Vietnam. Therefore, I think China would also make as a matter of high importance and priority infiltrating into Vietnam and taking Hanoi in at least the northern part of Vietnam, which I think they could quite easily do. It would quickly de-escalate into jungle warfare, guerrilla warfare like we saw in the Vietnam conflict, which is bloody, messy, and can go on for a long time. But again, just sheer manpower, I think China would just overrun Vietnam. Number one, the Vietnamese army is nothing like it was back in the 60s and 70s because they rely on the support of the United States now, post-war. And two, I just don't think the United States would be as committed to holding that position and getting entrenched in a jungle war. Just too much PTSD of the past, and being so close to the Chinese border, I just don't think there's a strategic opportunity for the United States to realistically win that conflict. So you could mark up Vietnam as a win for the Chinese as well. That would be a guerrilla campaign, jungle warfare that China would just dominate through sheer force and manpower. One thing you got to keep in mind here is that America would be at the disadvantage of having to defend the entire world because we are a global force. Now, many may see this as a pro because we have naval bases and military bases all around the world, but that spreads you thin. That means that you have a lot of places that you have to keep on the map and account for and keep track of. China would have the advantage of being consolidated, being centralized in familiar territory in their own homeland, which also gives you more of a nationalistic pride when you're fighting for your own home territory. The United States, with naval, air force, and army or marine forces deployed in the South China Sea, aren't going to have that level of commitment because that's not their home territory. It's about as far from home as you can get. The U.S. would have a very hard time maintaining their zones of control and their areas of influence in the South China Sea, and this is why I've chalked up those conflicts as likely Chinese wins, because it's so far from home and because the logistics supply chain could break down in so many different ways. Bringing in new resources, bringing in new equipment is very difficult when China starts picking off strategic locations like Taiwan, or just through naval force start attacking USC and making it hard to move forward or to retreat. So I think the U.S. could quickly, if they're not careful, get weighed down in the South China Sea, and that could quickly become a death trap for that theater of the war. So that brings me back to Japan, which, as I said earlier, I think would be a pivotal component, a pivotal player in the next World War. There's no secret that there's no love lost between the Japanese and the Chinese. The atrocities done against the Chinese people by Japan in World War II have never been forgotten by the Chinese people. And China has, voiced many times that they will never be a victim again, and they will never be victimized by Japan like they were in World War II. And for that reason, I think China would probably bring the war to Japan if there was any hint of Japanese aggression towards China, which there would be. Japan is a strong U.S. ally, and I think that their military presence and their prowess would be enough of a threat to the Chinese that it would make them want to act, or at least be ready to quickly react if Japan were to engage. The Japanese soldiers are known as being some of the most fierce, vicious, and just unrelenting soldiers in world history. I mean, going back to the samurai to up to the modern day, talking about the modern day Bushido warriors in World War II, Japan was just relentless. I mean, any American Marine who was deployed in the Pacific theater during World War II could tell you horror stories about how ferocious the Japanese were. I think just about anybody would rather fight the Germans on the Western Front than the Japanese on the Eastern Front if given the choice, because of the reputation that the Japanese had and lived up to, from kamikaze just to sheer brute force and will. The never say die attitude that the Japanese warriors are known for, even to this day. For that reason, I think Japan would probably launch an offensive across the sea and into the Korean theater, possibly to counteract the Koreans, which could maybe swing that into a stalemate. I know I said earlier on that I thought that would either be a stalemate or it would go toward China and North Korea. Well, if Japan were to get involved, I think that's the wild card, because if you have the U.S. and the South Koreans resisting from the sea and from the south, and you have the Japanese coming across the sea from the east, I think that could force a stalemate between North and South Korea, and a lot of blood and bodies lost with no real ground gained for either side. That would all come down to how Japan chooses to position itself in that conflict of the war. I think personally Japan would be more concerned with the Chinese mainland than with the Korean Peninsula, but you never know. I mean, the Korean Peninsula is much closer for them. It's much more of a clear and present danger if China were to make it a stronghold, so I could be wrong. Maybe Japan throws all their weight and their effort into the Korean Peninsula. And then all bets are off at that point, but I think it would likely end in a stalemate. Now, leaving the South China Sea and the Asian Peninsula, I think the most deadly theater of this war, without question, would be the Chinese and the Indian front. India is surrounded by Chinese allies. Pakistan, Nepal, Burma. They even had a skirmish up in the Himalayas just a few months ago between Chinese forces and Indian forces. I don't know if you recall that, but they were fighting with sticks and stones. They didn't even have guns on them, and they still managed to kill, I think, like 20 Indian soldiers, and a few Chinese soldiers died in return. What do you think they were doing up there? They're fighting over strategic military positioning. They're trying to build military encampments and strategic forts and strongholds so that in the event of a war, one will have the advantage over the other. It's China who's the aggressor here. They're the ones that are expanding into traditional neutral territory or territory claimed by India, and they're trying to make it a military stronghold because China sees the writing on the wall. Well, India sees it too. Narendra Modi, the president of India, would not take any sort of aggression from China lying down. He's a strongman type ruler, much like Putin in Russia. And I think what Modi would do is he would throw a huge military presence up to the Himalayas or the Nepalese border and push back any sort of Chinese aggression back into the western part of the Chinese territory. The problem for India is that while they were trying to fight off the Chinese aggressors in Nepal or into their northern border near Islamabad, they would also have to deal with Pakistan from the west. It's no secret that one of the most tense hotspots on the planet right now is the Kashmir region between India and Pakistan. They despise each other, and both of them are nuclear powers. Many people, war gamers who do this for a living, say that if a nuclear bomb were to go off in this century, that it would likely be in that region, somewhere in the Kashmir region between India and Pakistan, one of them lobbing it at the other. That's how intense the conflict is between those two nations. So India would have the huge, I can't emphasize this enough, disadvantage of having to deal with the powerful Chinese military on the north and northeast and the Pakistani military on the north and northwest. That might be an insurmountable task for them. What India does have in their favor is sheer manpower. India and China combined have more population today than the entire world had in 1940. Let that sink in. Those two nations alone, India and China, have 2.8 billion people. In 1940, there were 2.4 billion people on the face of the earth. What that tells me is that a ground attack, either launched through the Himalayas or launched from Pakistan into India, would quickly deteriorate into the bloodiest conflict in military history. This one theater of World War III would be bloodier than any war that's ever been fought in the history of our planet. There's no way I can overemphasize how important or the weight of the magnitude that carries with it, but I think this would be a sobering moment for all of humanity to see and to understand the cost and the true casualties of war. If anybody in this war finds themselves in the Chinese and the Indian theater, the Pakistani Indian theater, it would be safe to say that they would be in the deadliest place on earth in the history of mankind. As to how it would play out and who would win in that theater, it's really hard to say. I think India, like I said, being opposed by strong militaries on both sides, would have a very tough uphill battle. But I do think this would probably end in some sort of a bloody stalemate. I don't see a lot of ground being gained on either side just due to the rugged terrain and just the sheer ferocity and intensity of what would be going on there. I don't think China could fully engage themselves as much as they would like because of how much they're going to have to be concentrated on the Eastern Front. I think they would have less resources on the Western Front with India. Not expecting India to invade into China. Therefore, I think they may be a little bit more hesitant or reluctant to engage on that front. But if and when it breaks out, and it would break out, maybe initiated by Pakistan, China would have to engage. And when they did, they would have to commit fully to it. I would chalk this one up as neutral, probably ending in a stalemate. The next theater would be the Middle Eastern theater. So in this theater, which is a never-ending theater of war, you have Turkey, you've got Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, being the main players on one side, and then on the other you would probably have Iran, Syria, Iraq, and then you could say Russia as well, because Russia has maintained since 2010 or 11 a military presence off the coast of Syria, as well as special ops in Syria. So I think they may put some physical troops there. Although Russia has PTSD from the Afghan wars back in the Soviet Union days, so I don't think they would make that mistake twice of putting a large boots on the ground force in the Middle East, knowing that they can't really win there. But I do think that they would maintain a naval presence there, as well as some strategic support, as well as having the S-400 missile defense system being preeminent along with other Russian weapons throughout. They did take Crimea, and I think that they could operate from the Black Sea for that reason, maybe attacking Turkey from the Black Sea if they needed to. Turkey's kind of a wild card. Turkey could go either way. I mean, a few years ago, it seemed like Turkey and Russia were in cahoots, and then all of a sudden, there was some hostility there. The Turks shot down a Russian plane. Seemed like Russia and Turkey were on the outs, but then you have like this Nord Stream pipeline where it sounds like Russian oil giant, I think Rosneft is building it. I could be wrong, I'm not sure. But Russia building a pipeline through Turkey and through the Black Sea, so it seems like, there is some civility there. Right now, with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, I could see him going either way. He doesn't have any love lost with the West, but, he is a NATO ally. I could see him siding with the West for convenience sake, but I could also see him either staying neutral or allying himself possibly with Russia. He could very well be a guy who just waits to see which way the wind is blowing and then allies himself with the winning side. What I do think is that it would be game over for the Kurds. Matter of first priority for the Turks, no matter which side they come down on, would be to take any land occupied by the Kurds, which would not make the United States and its allies happy. So for that reason, maybe it does push Turkey into the arms of the Syrians or the Russians. Hard to say, but I think they would likely try to stay neutral as long as possible before having to sway one way or the other. The major players, though, here in this conflict would be Saudi Arabia and Iran and Syria. And I think that Iran and Syria would probably overrun Saudi Arabia, with the wild card being United States support. How much support does the U.S. want to throw behind the Saudi regime? I can tell you right now, the Saudi military is not nearly able to compete with the Iranians or the Syrians, for that matter, on their own without Western support. They have been buying Western weapons for years, for decades. They've even been buying Russian weapons. But as far as being able to use them effectively, I just don't think they have the experience or the know-how to do that. And it's very likely that the much more experienced, much more powerful Iranians would win a conflict between themselves and Saudi Arabia. And again, a very bad blood situation, much like China and Japan. Iran and Saudi Arabia, no love lost. Wild card there being the Israeli military. How does Israel get involved? Do they launch any sort of aggression against Iran in the Iranian homeland, against Tehran? Or do they do it covertly with something like Mossad, maybe doing some covert missions within Iranian territory, which is something they're very good at? It's possible, and I wouldn't count that out as a reality. But I think they would want to be careful because they don't have a large ground infantry that could compete with the Iranians or the Syrians to the north. And I don't think they want to get into a scenario where Iran or Syria is invading Israeli territory, which could very, very easily happen. So keep that in mind. I think that theater of war would be really hard to predict, but it would be a messy situation. But why should it be any different than what the Middle East has been for all of human history, right? The way I think it would end is likely a stalemate, with Turkey and Iran partitioning off the region. The Saudi military, again, not being able to hold their own. I think they would probably fall under the weight of Iranian aggression. I think if the Turks end up opposed to the Syrians, I think that Turkey could probably subdue Assad and the Syrian regime, and then you would probably have some sort of armistice or some sort of just chopping up of the land where portion of Iraq and the Kurdish territory goes into the Turkish sphere of influence. Israel probably would keep its territory, maybe expand and take some of the Palestinian territory that they haven't taken yet. Egypt would probably expand a little bit, and then you would have Iran taking, big swaths of land, either from Saudi Arabia or from Iraq. So probably a partitioning of the Middle Eastern region, leaving two hegemonic powers. My bets would be on Turkey and Iran coming out as the dominant winners in that region. And I guess you could say the third winner would be Israel if they did use the opportunity there, the crisis, to move in on the Palestinians and take more Palestinian territory, which I think would upset a lot of their Western allies, so maybe they would refrain from doing it. But like Rahm Emanuel says, never let a good crisis go to waste. For that reason, I do think that Israel would probably jump on the opportunity to take the West Bank and maybe even move into the Golan Heights. The next theater of war, as you can see now, we're just working our way around the world. This will be a global conflict, will be Europe. And in Europe, the real power player here is going to be Russia. And I think across from them, on the other side, is going to be the French and the Germans, but primarily the French. Many people think of Germany as the powerhouse in Europe. And militarily, they were, obviously, up until World War II. And they still are from an economic and a production sense, but not from a military sense anymore. Because of all the handcuffs put on Germany after World War II, they never, and I think a sense of self-shame as well, they never really recovered in a military sense. And for that reason, they're going to have to rely on other allies in the region to really act as a counterweight to Russia. I remember meeting a guy from Germany a few years ago out west in California, and he told me, he said, if there's ever conflict between Europe and Russia again, Russia could be in Munich within a month because there's just no resistance to stop them. I mean, NATO would like to think that they have tripwire forces in place and they have the ability to counteract Russia before they impose their will onto Europe, but I think Eastern Europe would be a lost cause. I think Russia could just blitzkrieg style run right through the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They could easily take Poland, I believe, as well. That's where they're going to first encounter some NATO resistance, but I think it's laughable if you think what NATO has in place in Poland or anywhere in Eastern Europe is going to be able to do more than just stub the toe of the Russians. It's going to be a minor nuisance for them, but it's not going to stop them. Russia's going to push right on. I don't think that they would have the will to push further than Poland, though. And that's why I say, even though they could, I think they would probably exercise some restraint there and then maybe just strengthen their positioning and reclaiming some of the territory of the old Soviet Union. I don't think they would push through Germany. I could be wrong. If they did, I don't think they'd meet any meaningful resistance until they run face first into the French. Even then, I think the Russians would probably come out victorious, but you shouldn't underwrite the French military. They've really grown a lot in the last couple of decades, and Emmanuel Macron and his predecessor have really made an emphasis on rebuilding the French military. And I think at this point, it's safe to say that the French are the strongest military in Europe. With a little bit of backing from the UK, from the Italians, from the Spanish, I think they could put together a meaningful resistance to make it not worth Russia's while to continue trying to advance west. I don't think that Putin has the will to do that. I don't think he sees any value in it. I don't think he wants to even create the old Soviet Union. I think he just wants to expand Russia to the point where it has the strategic resources it needs to kind of recover some of its old glory. But I don't think he has any grandiose dreams of rebuilding the Soviet Union. Therefore, I think what would happen is, as I said, Russia would push into Ukraine, definitely. Belarus is an ally. And then they would go from there into the Baltics and Poland and then kind of reclaim those Soviet states, those Eastern Slavic states. But that's probably where the Russian advance stops. And then you have Russia right up on the borders of Germany at that point. Germany kind of becoming a neutral player, I think. I think they would kind of be torn at that point between the East and the West and probably would try to stay neutral as much as possible. But the barrier then would be Germany between France and Russia. Now, I need to emphasize, though, that unlike World War II, this theater of the war would take a backseat to the Asian front or the Asian theater. It's not going to be like the Ostfront in World War II, where the Germans and the Russians just stack bodies on bodies on bodies to just unprecedented levels. It would be a much more civilized and a much more tame theater of the war compared to what's going to be happening in the East, particularly on the Chinese and Indian border or in the Korean Peninsula. I don't think that you're going to see major conflict once Russia gets beyond Ukraine and the Baltics in the European theater. As long as France and Germany operate as that firewall, I don't see Russia pushing further, and I don't see Europe trying to push into Moscow or anything like that. I think that because Russia has hedged itself as a preeminent nuclear power, there's really no advantage to poking the bear, poking the hornet's nest there, and they would just let it be. So Russia has a little bit, well, I should say a lot, but territorially speaking, a little bit to gain, and I don't think Europe would put up much of a resistance from letting them gain it. They wouldn't be happy. It would definitely be a punch in the mouth, but I think Ukraine would become a casualty, and the Baltics would become a casualty, possibly Poland as well. It may end up being the end of NATO, and that's one big thing I don't think should be overlooked. I think NATO exist for the purpose of containing Russia. And once it becomes apparent to the world that they're unable to do that, people will say, what's the point? Why are we even paying for this? So I do think that that's one big benefit that you could chalk up into the win column for Russia, apart from the territorial gain that we just discussed. I think the collapse of NATO would be an outcome of World War III. I just don't see Russia taking advantage of that and pushing into those countries. Maybe Finland as well, maybe, but I don't even see them doing that. I think they would stop within the borders of the old Soviet Union, and that would be it, and would kind of revert back to the mean in terms of Russian positioning. Now, a couple new frontiers that did not exist at the time of the last major conflict I want to talk about briefly. Number one being space. People laughed when Donald Trump talked about Space Force a couple of years ago, and people used to laugh when Ronald Reagan talked about it in the 80s, and maybe then it was a little bit more fantastical, but it's not anymore. And this is a very plausible, real thing that needs to be taken into consideration. There will be no shortage of conflicts in space in the next World War. It'll be a battle of satellites, and Trump was very smart, I think, to institute the Space Force to prepare for that, because China has been, and China will continue to position themselves to have an advantage in space, in the sense that these are the eyes and ears of the modern world. If you dominate in space, you have a God's eye view of what's going on in the ground. And I think China is going to try to make a move to poke the eyes out of the Western allies when actual hot conflict kicks off. For that reason, Space Force needs to exist in the West to be able to counteract that measure. Otherwise, you're giving your opponent the advantage of having, like I said, a God's eye view of everything going on below you. Strategic weapons positioning, strategic missile systems, all that gets a huge, huge upgrade if you have a God's eye view. So you can expect to see a lot of battles between satellites, a lot of satellites being shot down, a lot of weapons being used within Earth's atmosphere above ground. So I'll leave it at that from the space front, because it's really just too hard to predict how that will play out. It's never happened before, but it's going to be the closest thing to sci-fi that we've ever seen in military engagements on planet Earth. I can guarantee you that. The second new frontier will be on the digital front. I mean, we see a little bit of this in small scale now, mostly through covert espionage, but you'll see it now through nation states, where maybe they'll plant Trojanware that can bring down banking systems or lock up weapon systems, ransomware being used. Those types of things are going to become much more prominent. And this could actually, I shouldn't underemphasize this, I just don't know how to talk about it because it's so new and it's so outside of the realm of expertise for me, that I think that's kind of the point. It's so outside of the realm of expertise of so many people, especially those who are military minded, because they've never had to engage with it before. I think the tradition of military conflict is to fight the next war based on the lessons learned in the previous one. Well, this is going to be one of those scenarios. The digital front in the war, the digital theater, is going to create textbooks for future West Points and future military historians, to the point where the next war after World War III will just be completely redefined because of what we learn in the digital front. And maybe the same is true for the space theater as well, but definitely in the digital theater, because there's weapon systems and technologies that exist today that make it so computer hackers are almost as strong as nuclear weapons. And that's not an understatement. If this proves to be the case, it could be the pivotal shift that changes the outcome or shifts the balance of the war. I just don't know for certain, and I don't want to commit to anything other than saying that it has the potential to be that significant. As to which way it goes, I don't know. I mean, we know we have these capabilities on both sides. The U.S. has some of the most amazing minds and technological capabilities when it comes to cyber warfare. But we know from experience that the North Koreans have it as well. The Iranians have it, and the Chinese certainly have it. The Russians are known for it. So this is just going to be something that's way too hard to predict. I call it a wild card. It could go any direction. But you got to look at things like social media, banking, internet, cyber defenses, the electricity grid. You bring down a country's electrical grid, all bets are off. So I call these cyber bombs. You might even call them cyber nuclear bombs. It's just hard to predict where they're going to be dropped. So I'll call this one a toss-up, but it may have the ability to shift the outcome of the war in more fronts than one. Another new frontier will be robots. You look at things like Boston Dynamics and their dog-type robot called Spot. The military is employing these types of robotic creatures, obviously, to preserve human casualty. They don't want to have human loss when they don't need to. So you bring in these robotic weapons, which is what they are, no matter how much they look like dogs or humans or whatever. It's really hard to predict how that would go. What I do think is that this could lead to unimaginable atrocities because robots don't have consciences. When you have a scenario where drones or on-ground land force robots are infiltrating cities where there are civilians, it could get really ugly really quick. And I don't even like to think about it. It kind of gives me cold chills just thinking about it. But there's a dystopian futuristic episode of Black Mirror actually about this. It's got the Boston Dynamic type creature, that dog Spot, in it. And I won't give it away, but you should go watch that episode if you want to just get a little taste of what I think this future type of warfare could look like when you engage robots. I think it may lead to truly unimaginable atrocities in the sense of civilian deaths and human casualties. I'll leave it at that. And then the last frontier that I will mention is what I call the wildcard frontier. And that's the one that I mentioned as being an impenetrable front earlier on. We've never had a large global conflict on the U.S. homeland. I think that could possibly change in World War III. I remember being a kid, like 5 to 7 years old. I would have dreams about waking up and looking out my window and seeing Chinese military marching down the road in formation, seeing civilians taken hostage, relocated to concentration camps, seeing people executed and pushed off hills. I guess the biggest concern is my own mental state. What kind of 7-year-old dreams and thinks about that type of stuff? But it did. Like, it popped into my head many times as a kid. And I always wondered why I had that recurring dream. And it was always Chinese, by the way, always Chinese military. But I had recurring dreams of Chinese military marching down the streets of the small podunk town that I lived in upstate New York. Why did I have that? I don't know. It was before I really knew anything about global affairs. I was a little kid. The older I get, though, the more I wonder if that was some sort of premonition. Because if there's any military that can bring the war to the Americans on their own soil, it would be the Chinese. Because every other military in the world would go through the American wood chipper of naval, artillery, and air defense to try to make it to our border. They would just get sliced up to the point where there'd be nothing left of them by the time they got here. China doesn't have that level of concern. The reason why? The billion-man army we just discussed. If they can win a naval domination in the South China Sea, then that leaves an open road all the way to the American West Coast. And that, my friends, would be a game changer because that's never happened before in history. Try to picture, if you can, a Battle of Los Angeles or the Battle of Seattle, the Battle of Honolulu. I mean, these things could be very real possibilities if China has a few chips fall in their favor in World War III. And I'm not writing it off. I'm not saying it's likely. That's why I call it a wild card. But I think this could throw everybody's head for a spin if China was to make it to the U.S. homeland. No one's ever done it before. No one's even tried. The closest we ever got was Japan attacking Pearl Harbor, and that was basically just a bee sting. This would be different. Not to mention that with Russia as an ally, Russia could just fly sorties down Alaska, down the Pacific coast, and they could just bomb the hell out of the American West Coast if the U.S. is spread thin enough in the South China Sea or in other theaters of the war. I mean, obviously they're going to meet resistance, and there would be heavy casualties for the Russians and the Chinese as well. The U.S. military is amazing, and I think that we would probably come out on the winning side of any sort of air engagement with the Russians. But it doesn't mean the Russians wouldn't do a significant amount of damage. If they could just clear the way a little bit through bombing the hell out of the western coast, losing their own aircraft in the process, then that would open the way for mostly, the majority of it being Chinese, but maybe some Russian infantry as well. But it would open the way for a Chinese land invasion on the West Coast. I'm not saying it's likely. Again, I put this probably like 25% odds. But that's really high odds considering the fact that it's never happened before. And again, maybe I'm just kind of biased because I used to have dreams about it all the time. I do think that it's a real possibility. And I think if it were to happen, it would likely happen through the West Coast. Could be wrong. Maybe they come north over the Arctic. I have no idea what's in store there. Russia's been doing a lot of things in the Arctic, but I think most likely what would happen is in this scenario, for this scenario to play out, the U.S. would have to lose major naval battles at sea in the Asian front, and then China would have to push their advantage toward the American homeland on the West Coast after that. And then in order to get close enough and make it through that wood chipper, they would need to counteract U.S. air defenses, either by enlisting Russian support or relying on Chinese Air Force abilities, which I think the American Air Force would dominate the Chinese Air Force. So they would need the Russians to make this happen, which is why it's a lot of it's a wild card. But just don't write it off, because it could happen. But in my opinion, if a war gets to this stage where an invasion on the U.S. homeland is possible, that means the U.S. is already down big and definitely got their back against the wall. So what would the outcome of this war be? Well, I think that the likely outcome really depends on a couple of factors. And I don't want this to sound like a cop-out. I'll give you my opinion, but it really does hinge on a couple of factors. Number one, China. Can China live up to the hype? If they can bring the full potential of their industry and their population to bear, they will win, without doubt. Just the numbers are insurmountable. No army with that much of a numerical advantage, a 4-to-1 ratio, has ever lost in human history, just for the record. China would not be the first. It comes down to whether or not logistically they can mobilize. Can the megalithic Chinese industry that we've been hearing about for so long, that just led to rapid growth and expansion, can it live up to the moment? If it can, then China wins, and we don't have to discuss this any farther. But if not, and there's reason to suspect that it might not, it's really hard to mobilize something that large, that rapid, when you're being attacked on multiple fronts. If not, then I think that China would probably collapse under its own weight a little bit, and they would implode, and they would have to go into defensive mode rather than attack mode. And that would lead to some sort of either truce or just an outright Chinese loss. The other big variable is American allies. American diplomatic and military alliances have kind of suffered in the last few years under the Trump presidency. And I know I was kind of praising him a little bit earlier with some of the things he's done with isolationism, but one of the downsides of that is that our alliances have suffered around the world. And that raises some red flags in wartime around whether or not we can mobilize our allies in time to, really deliver that first crippling blow. If not, then I think the U.S. is in big trouble. Big trouble. One, because they're spread thin. We are spread thin. Number two, I think that the U.S. is going to have a really hard time logistically making things work dealing with a global conflict. Even in World War II, we were really operating heavily in two theaters, the Asian Pacific and then the European theater, but primarily the Asian Pacific for America. So it wasn't, I'm not saying it was easy by any means, but it wasn't as hard as it will be in the next war when America doesn't have as much military power to rely on from their European allies. America is going to be driving the seat at the table. That's going to be hard, especially when you're going up against China and Russia. But if America can mobilize its allies in the first year, they should win, and I think they would win. I think that the American alliance would win if they can mobilize NATO in Europe, India, get Turkey on their side, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and then you could throw in some smaller countries too, like Israel, other countries in Europe, etc. I just don't know what the likelihood of that is, that type of mobilization within the first year. But it would be pivotal for American success. Another thing that I think is likely, no matter who wins, is a Russian and Franco-German peace deal in Europe. Like I was saying previously, I think Russia would push to take back a lot of its old Soviet territories, but then it would stop there. And I think Europe would be fine with giving them Eastern Europe if it meant peace going forward. So I think Russia comes out a winner in this war, most likely in terms of territory, no matter what. As long as no nukes get dropped on Moscow, I think Russia comes out a winner. Another wild card, and I'm not saying this is likely, but I think it's a potential outcome, is that in the aftermath of World War III, assuming that China does win, I think Russia could stab China in the back. Maybe they could do it during the war, near the end, and it could be one of those pivotal moments in history. I think Russia could, maybe turn on the Chinese, leading to China's demise, and then kind of restoring Russia's seat as the dominant power to counterbalance the United States. What I think is more likely, though, is that if China were to win, or at least even in a true scenario, if they were to expand and grow into major global superpower, I think a Russian-Chinese conflict could be on the horizon a couple decades later. Kind of like coming out of World War II, we had the Cold War immediately after between Russia and the United States. I think Russia and China will look each other in the eye after this war and realize that being so close to each other and both so powerful that they're going to see each other as a threat. So much, I shouldn't say this, but much like World War II prompted the Cold War, I think World War III could prompt a new Cold War and possibly even another hot war, but this time between Russia and China. Another thing that I think is likely is that this war will not end by seizing the other power's capital. It's not going to be like the days of old where if Moscow falls or if Berlin falls, the war is over. That won't happen. If DC falls, the war is not over. This will simply be a war of attrition, a battle of wills, and it will not end until the other side simply loses the will to fight. I think that would likely happen in the Chinese-Indian front first, due to the mass casualties unlike the planet's ever seen before. Americans, much like the Asian countries, have it in their DNA to fight to the death, and I think they will, and that's why I think this will undoubtedly be the bloodiest war in history. It's also why I think it could ultimately go nuclear. As I said at the beginning, I don't think this war will begin with nuclear weapons. I absolutely don't think that. But I do think it will end with them. And this is why I spend so much time talking about it on this podcast. This is why I spend so much time emphasizing the importance of the hour in which we live. Because we truly are just minutes to midnight right now. Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 50 years. I don't think it is, but maybe. But I don't think it's 60. I don't think it's 51. And that should concern you, because that means it's in most of our lifetimes. What is going to happen on this earth? And I don't know what you make of the UFO reports and the government coming out saying that we have been in contact with entities from other civilizations. We've read reports in recent days. An Israeli military leader came out and said that the other day. The Pentagon has said that they have off-world crafts in their possession. Make of that what you will. I don't know what you make of it, but I don't think it's a coincidence that what we hear as a theme is that all these quote-unquote aliens that keep visiting us keep saying that we're about to destroy ourselves due to nuclear war and our technology. I don't think there's a coincidence that they're so urgently trying to spread that message. And I believe there's truth to it, and maybe you don't, but I think Bob Lazar, David Fravor, guys like that are telling the truth. And if they are, and if there are other entities here trying to prepare us for what's about to happen, then I think we should be even more prepared. Because I think this does end with a scorched earth policy. And that scorched earth policy will be, if we can't win, they can't either. And that's when I think the nuclear weapons come into play. I think when either the US or China or the Russians or the Indians or the Turks, you name it, feel like they're about to be eliminated from the battlefield, I think they start to go kamikaze mode. And that is when all bets are off. And there are no winners at that point. So my word of caution is that we need to be bracing for that potential outcome. No matter who wins, I would much rather it be a nation state than a nuclear bomb. And my fear is that this ends in nuclear holocaust, no matter how the chips fall in the various theaters of the war. But hopefully we can avoid that outcome. So my opinion, based on all those caveats and all of those variables that I just named, is that a Chinese-Russian alliance will be nearly impossible to overcome. I'm not a nationalist, but that doesn't mean I'm not patriotic. I'm an American. I love this country. I would like to believe that the American way of life will exist for thousands of years into the future, more or less. I mean, I think we get a little carried away with our capitalism sometimes, but I love this country and I love our way of life for the most part. I have no desire to see that end, but I think I will in my lifetime. And that concerns me for my children and for my children's children. And that's why I spend so much time, researching these things and talking about it to strangers on this podcast, because it doesn't have to be that way. Nothing's written in stone. But I'm a fan of history. I'm somebody who loves to study history and look to the lessons of history. And it's quoted to Mark Twain. I don't know if he ever actually said it, but he said, allegedly, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Well, America's rhyming right now with a lot of empires from the past. We spread ourselves too thin. We get too cocky, too arrogant in our ways. And we either implode internally or we're conquered by a foreign power. I don't think in a conventional war, one-on-one, America could ever be conquered by any global power in the world, including China. But I think in the scenario I just outlined for you, I think America's focus will be divided to so many different theaters that it's going to be spread too thin that it will ultimately either collapse under her own weight or she will be defeated by her enemies. And I didn't even mention our most clear and present threat, which is our internal strife. Americans hate each other more than they ever have before. You can thank social media for a lot of that. You can thank our extreme politics, left and right. And for that reason, I think that there's a very likely chance that America could just tear apart internally before the first shots are even fired in World War III. And if that were to happen, then America certainly has no chance of winning, America or her allies. So keep that in mind as well. We need to heal the wounds internally before we can worry about protecting from the blows that are going to be coming from the outside. I think that we're being warned by entities from other civilizations. I think we're being warned by our own governments of the hour in which we live. I think most of us go through our days with our heads stuck in our phone. We don't think in terms of big picture. But a day's going to come sooner rather than later where we don't have the luxury of averting our eyes anymore. We're going to have to stare it right in the face because it's going to come right to our doorstep. So you need to do the things you can now in your small little corner of the world to prepare yourself and your family to be able to weather the storm, to be able to survive it, and hopefully, if the hour calls upon you, to demonstrate courage and to know what to do in that moment. But just know that the hour is always closer than it seems. We are minutes to midnight, and you don't want to be caught falling asleep before the final stroke. The wise man makes preparations in peacetime for the war that is to come.